Hi all, welcome to the documentation team's presentation about how you and the technical writers work together to create and maintain OpenSearch's end-user documentation. Over the next 20 minutes, Vineet and I will guide you through the documentation process, the expectations of writers and developers, and the importance of collaboration between us. Our goals for this presentation are for you to learn more about the value of documentation and the benefits of collaboration between writing and development teams, including UX and product management. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of our presentation, at which time we have reserved 10 minutes for Q&A. So with that, let's get started. So why is documentation important? Documentation is an essential part of any development project. It helps users understand how to use the product effectively and which use cases it best serves. It is a critical part of software adoption as it reduces the learning curve, improves the user experience, and increases productivity. As an open source software, OpenSearch documentation also invites the OpenSearch community to actively participate in creating a more user-centric product. So, scope and limitations of technical writers. Technical writers are responsible for creating and maintaining OpenSearch documentation. We work with you, product management, and UX to gather information, develop a content plan, write, edit, and review content, test the documentation from the end user's perspective, and keep documentation updated. The writers rely on development teams to answer questions like, who is the audience? What are their needs and expectations? What are the most common use cases that users need, or tasks that users need to do? How will the documentation be used? Answering these questions gives both the writers and developers a better understanding of the documentation's purpose and goals. We are not developers or engineers, and thus we do not have the same level of expertise as you. We are not always able to understand the technical details of the features we are documenting, and therefore your technical insights are necessary to ensure documentation is accurate. Writers need you to provide, for example, the right code examples to help users understand the concepts and functionality of the software, which is especially useful for new users and provides all users with a starting point for their own code. We hope that by clarifying the writer's capabilities and responsibilities, we can improve the communication and collaboration between you and us, and in turn, improve the quality of the OpenSearch documentation. So, how do writers support developers? The writer's primary goal is to create clear, easy to find, and understandable information. We help you ensure error messages are concise and actionable and are consistent with the overall style of our documentation and brand. We help you ensure parameter names are consistent and descriptive. We help you ensure user text is clear, concise, and accessible to users. We also help you ensure content is accurate and up to date and help identify and correct errors and omissions. And we help ensure users can easily find the information they need. By supporting these tasks, we help you improve the usability of OpenSearch by making the documentation more audience-focused and user-friendly, and by providing clear, engaging instructions about how to use OpenSearch. So, by now you may be asking, what is the OpenSearch documentation process? Over the next 5 minutes, I'll walk you through the process of developing and publishing content for front-end features. Vineet will follow with developing and publishing content for back-end features. Responsibilities in the workflow depend upon your role. For example, a front-end developer is responsible for providing the writer with the necessary information to write complete documentation and test the feature from the end user's perspective. The writer, in turn, is responsible for collecting that information and creating user-friendly, appropriate documentation for that audience. A well-defined documentation process is essential for creating and maintaining relevant documentation. So that we're all on the same page, the colors represent roles. Blue is developer, gold is writer, and turquoise is editor. The three roles are integral in publishing quality documentation for our users. So with that, let's move into the roles and responsibilities in the documentation process for a front-end feature. Providing information is a crucial part of the process. Without information, we don't have documentation. Developers are the primary source of information. You have the deepest understanding of the product and are responsible for providing accurate, up-to-date information to the writer. You are expected to be involved in the documentation process and be available to answer writers' questions and to review draft documentation. Specific examples of how you can provide information to the writer include providing the writer with a product overview, that is a description of the feature, its benefits, and the target audience. Providing the writer with use cases and user stories. This helps the writer understand how the product is used and write relevant documentation to the user's needs. Providing the writer with screenshots and videos. This helps illustrate complex concepts and make the documentation more engaging. Reviewing draft documentation and providing feedback. This ensures the documentation is accurate and relevant to the target audience. Now, you may be saying, wow, that's a lot of information you're asking of me. Rest assured, you aren't the only developer who has these responsibilities. They are standard expectations for developers within and outside of Amazon and are necessary in producing polished, accurate information for our users. So once this information has been provided, the writer gets busy writing. The writers write documentation such as user guides, tutorials, and UI copy. The writer is responsible for taking all the information you've provided and turning it into well-written documentation for the target audience, and testing that documentation to ensure it works as described. These tasks are essential for the user's understanding of how to use the product, and they often result in the writer catching issues before a release. The information you provide gives the writers a foundational understanding of the product. The writers take your information, organize it logically, and then translate the complex concepts into more digestible, user-friendly content. Ultimately, writers use their skills to help users get the most out of OpenSearch. While writing, the writer will reach out to the developer to ask clarifying questions. It's important that you respond, as failure to respond causes content gaps, inaccuracies, and unneeded frustration. Following the draft documentation, we're ready for technical review. During technical review, the developer is responsible for ensuring the content is technically accurate, identifying any inconsistencies, providing technical feedback such as suggesting improvements, clarifying complex concepts, or recommending additional information that may be helpful to users, and approving the PR to confirm the content is technically accurate. The writer, in turn, during the technical review, is responsible for addressing your feedback and making the changes. Keep in mind that the focus during technical review is about improving the documentation. Once the documentation has technical review approval, the writer sends the documentation through a documentation review, or doc review for short. The doc review is performed by a peer technical writer. The reviewer provides actionable, specific feedback to improve the quality of the documentation. The doc reviewer also ensures the documentation has a consistent tone, style, and format. The writer collaborates with the peer reviewer during this process and makes changes based on the reviewer's suggestions. A doc review is required on all documentation, and once the documentation is approved, it goes to editorial. Editorial review is required before any documentation is published. The editor is an early reader of the content, acting on the user's behalf. The editor is responsible for ensuring clarity and consistency, that is, spelling, grammar, punctuation, adherence to style guidelines. The editor is also responsible for improving readability and maintaining brand voice. The editing process ensures that we apply high standards to our work in order to deliver it to the right audience and continually raise bar. In practical terms, this means that editors ensure that defects or quality issues do not get sent down the line. The writer collaborates with the editor to make changes and finalize the documentation for publication on the documentation website. Note that during doc review and editorial review, writers may have questions for the developer. Oftentimes, these questions are about confirming accuracy of the information and ensuring any changes retain the intended meaning. It is crucial that you are responsive to the writer, as at this stage, it is the deadline for publishing the documentation for release. So Now that you've learned a little bit about the roles and responsibilities in writing documentation for front-end features, Faneet will guide you through writing documentation for back-end features. Faneet, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. So now let's discuss the documentation process for a backend feature. This is where things changed a little bit, because in the past, documentation issues sometimes contain just links to an RFC and a development issue or PR. Now the process has changed slightly, so we ask you to provide all info in a PR or a quip. This includes all the information that I'm going to go over on the next slide. This has to be done by the first release candidate build date, and it's the part of release candidate entrance criteria now. So as part of the information, please provide illustrative, in-depth examples that are, of course, tested and working. In Google Analytics, we've seen that people are consistently asking for better examples and the more descriptive examples. If you're writing an API documentation, please describe all the query parameters, path parameters, and request response fields. We do have an API template that you can fill in, and I'll show that in a couple of slides, but that will help you provide API documentation. For the 2.10 release, there were a lot of features that added to the existing Elastic 7.10 features that were not documented on our documentation site. For example, concurrent segment search added to Profile API, but there was no Profile API page on our site. So when you start coding, please take a look at where the documentation should be on the documentation site. And if you find that this is the situation, let us know so we can prioritize adding the prerequisite documentation. Okay, so what information do we need for documentation? The users basically need to know the why, what, and how. Why does the user need this? If there's a similar feature, what differentiates this feature from the other one? What is the functionality? That's an overview of what the functionality is trying to achieve. Is there any terminology that the user might be confused about that we should list? For example, search pipelines versus ingest pipelines sound similar but are different things. What background info does the user need to know? For example, in a snapshot management, we've added a state machine so it will be easier for people to follow the documentation. What are the prerequisites that the user needs to know or install? How does the user use this functionality? That's an example that I was talking about. And also, what edge cases, limitations, warnings, and recommendations do you have for the user? So basically, try to ease the pain points for the users preventatively. Here are some examples. I'm not going to show them now, but we will provide this presentation after this is over, and you can go and look. This has four very different examples that developers have provided in terms of documentation. It has a new API documentation. It has a full feature documentation like model access control, a small update to the API response, and a documentation for a new field type. So if you provided the information in a quip, a technical writer can't put up a PR, but the PR has to be, again, done by the release candidate first build date. The technical writer will make sure the documentation is put in the appropriate section, and we can push to the same PR because we have maintainer permissions, so there's no need to add us as collaborators for your PR on GitHub. We can organize and format the information, we'll edit for clarity, and we'll make sure that adheres to the style guide. We also will link to any other relevant documentation. But during this process, again, as Melissa mentioned, we may have questions on rewording, so please be available and responsive for this part. We want to make sure that we didn't lose any technical accuracy. And then the editorial review comes. That's exactly the same as for the front-end feature. Basically, go over grammar, punctuation, and adherence to the style guide, and all the things that Melissa already mentioned. So what are the resources that you can use? we do have, as I mentioned before, an API template that I'm going to show you right here. So this has all the sections, all the labels, all the buttons that we've put in, the copy buttons. So basically, if you just fill in this template, then some sections may not apply because sometimes there are no query parameters or path parameters, but this is a comprehensive API template. Now, what else do we have? We have a veil linter, and the veil linter makes sure that you have no sometimes grammatical, but also spelling errors. If you see something like on the right on your PR, please make sure to implement those comments before the editorial review, because this will definitely speed it up. Now, the next three sources are README in our documentation. And here you can find our style guide that tells you how to write. Now, OpenSearch terms that lists all the commonly used terms. The API style guide is a more descriptive information for the API template. So if you want to read more into it. And then the formatting guide is how to format frequently used markdown elements. So for example, we've added buttons. Here's how to use buttons and call outs and whatnot. But again, as technical writers, we can do all this work for you. You just need to provide this information. But if you're interested, please feel free to peruse this. Then we have the contributing guidelines. And here you'll see how to run the site locally. So if you're making minor changes, you can just make them on GitHub. But if you're making major changes and you want to make sure that the documentation is formatted correctly, basically fork the repo, the documentation repo, and then you install Jekyll. And then we have a build script that you can use that runs the site locally. So for example, I'm running on localhost right now. This is the local copy of the documentation. So these are the resources that we have. And now we're ready to ship it. So for frequently asked questions, how long does it take for a merged PR to appear on the site? After we merge a PR, the build is triggered. So it takes about 10 minutes and you'll see the PR right away. On the staging side, if you don't have a link to staging site, then if you backport to the version that you're looking for in the previous documentation, you'll see it right away after the build time. Do you have to merge documentation PRs by code freeze? Well, now there's not really code freeze, but by the first release candidate build date. Not the first one, but we do have to merge by the release candidate final build date. Does the documentation team have a code freeze for documentation? We don't, but the earlier you do things, the better. So we do appreciate early collaboration. And can a release be held because of incomplete documentation? Yes, because now part of the release candidate exit criteria is having all the documentation done. So it definitely happened before and it can be held because of documentation.